Hello everyone, and welcome to today's session. I hope that you can hear me loud and clear. I'm coming to you live, as it were, from the Edexcel's headquarters down in London, and looking forward to working with you today on trying to get through the controlled assessment standardization that we're talking about. This event we're running today is actually based on a face-to-face event. And the face-to-face events have been very well attended, and we've had some interesting discussions. So I hope that in this virtual environment that we've got here today, particularly if you're new to this kind of training, you'll be happy to sort of pose questions and to work with each other as best you can to come up with some answers and things. So let's have a look at what we're going to be doing today. So clearly, in terms of our sort of presentation, John has already mentioned some of these things about recording and technical difficulties and things. I'm joined today by Chloe, who's the support from Inset Online. So if you've got any issues listening to me, sorry, not listening to me, hearing what I'm saying rather, then Chloe can hopefully sort you out of all of those things. And remember that there is a pack of materials which supports this event that you can download in the window below the screen that you're looking at, the area which says Delegate Materials Zip Pack as well. Sorry to scare you early on in the session. That's what I am, and that's what I look like. So I'm the principal moderator for GCSE Spec B. I thought you'd like to see that. Just so that you understand I'm a kind of real person. And in terms of what we're looking at today, our aims of the session, I suppose, is again a kind of a version that we've tried to work up based on our face-to-face event. So look at what standardization is, and to review some examples of pieces of work. We're going to consider the implications of the kind of linearization of the specification and some of the changes that have taken place. We'll look very briefly at the new mark scheme for 2014 as well, and one of the things we'll consider at the end is this 2,000 word limit, which is part of the new specification for 2014 as well. We're going to spend a little bit of time doing that, so if you have got questions and queries, save them till a bit later on in terms of that, which I'm sure you will have, and I'll try and fill you in terms of what we've got. So our timings today, and we should be fairly well on time, is that roughly between now and about 10 to 5, depends really how quickly I talk and how much time we have for activities, but roughly between now and 10 to 5 we're going to look at kind of reviewing controlled assessment, background to changes, and also confirming levels of control, and we'll have a few activities there. And then our second session, when we've had a chance for a tea break, is going to run from about 5 till 6, and I promise I'll try not to overrun. I've got to go back to Somerset tonight, which is quite a torturous journey at the best of times, least of all when we've had all this rain, and as you've seen, those sort of washed out railway lines at Exeter are not improving the conditions for getting back down to the southwest. So we will finish promptly at that time, and our second session is looking at examples of pieces of work in a bit more detail. And as I said to you before, you've got all of these packs that you can download in the materials, to be honest. So one of the things we're going to start with is a little bit of a review of controlled assessment, and I'm just going to bring on a poll for you to have a look at. I hope that looks okay, Chloe, otherwise you might adjust it for me. And it's just trying to work out whether or not, you know, some ideas about how long you've been teaching the specification, and whether or not you're new to it. So it gives me a little bit of a flavour and a background for who my audience is. Clearly I can't see you and you can't see me. It's not a test in any way, just you know, put the check boxes down, and then in a second or two I'll broadcast the results so that you should be able to see what the results are. So we've got a real mixture of people here. There's a few people who've been teaching it a very long time. I didn't specify how long that is. I hope that you're enjoying the specification, and you can you know, can sort of act as ambassadors for us, really. There's a couple of people who are new to delivering. There's a couple of you who've only been teaching it relatively short time. So one of the things to bear in mind is that clearly controlled assessment is not actually I suppose not necessarily a new thing. It's an evolution of coursework, and one of the things to think about as well is this kind of idea about management of controlled assessment as well. And again, Chloe, if you can make sure that that poll is viewing nicely for the delegates, really. One of the things I'd like to find out about whether or not, because I think this is a big issue for people, is how you think the school management of controlled assessment. You may be responsible for that, or it may indeed be senior management or head of humanities or whatever the structure is, but do you think it's a good job? And again, if you're one of these people rather who kind of, you know, off the SMT radar or whatever, perhaps today's session will help you to feed back some information about management, because it is key to the success and outcomes of what it is that we're trying to achieve today, because successful management of controlled assessment generally leads to a better learning approach for the students, and it generally means that it's less stressful for you. But I do appreciate the whole controlled assessment baggage, I suppose, if I use that word, is problematic in some centres, and you know, there's room for improvement, certainly. The other thing, finally, to bring on as a poll, this is the final poll we're going to have just before we move right into the PowerPoint, is to think about this summer's controlled assessment and whether your results were actually better than, or as you'd expected in terms of this. Now, I know clearly you are marking the controlled assessment. We just have the external moderation of what you're doing. But actually, you know, did things live up to your expectations? And one of the things I would ask you to reflect on in the course of today's session is, when you look at other people's work and the way in which controlled assessment is approached by other centres, is there anything for you can learn from it? I'm not in any way encouraging you to copy what you see, but if you can learn from good practice, then clearly that's got to be one of the aims and objectives for today's session, to be honest. So I'll just broadcast those results again. There has been one person who has had their marks changed. We tend to find on this spec that it runs somewhere between 6 and 10% of people have their marks changed, and that could be either up or down. That's comparable with other specifications in the sort of geography portfolio, although this has less change than some people do, or sorry, some qualifications do. You know, some of you are actually finding that your students, you know, expecting my students to have done better. I hope that you've got some ideas in your own mind about why that might have been the case. And for the majority of you, the modal category we've got here is that for most of you it was in line with the previous year's performance. But again, I hope that there is room for improvement. Now, our first slide that we start with, and again, if you find this quite small based on the learning environment that you're in at the moment at your school, you may be looking at this individual on a computer screen or huddling around an interactive whiteboard. If you find it too small, press the full screen button at the top, but that will mean that you block out some of the other areas of the windows that you can see. So, why have we embarked on controlled assessment? Well, clearly it was a government strategy in sort of 2007, 2008. But these were some of the things that I suppose that the QCA at that time, which has effectively been replaced by Ofqual, this is some of the things they aspired to: higher quality end result, fairer and more equitable way of learning, encouraging student-centered learning, to be able to produce a variety of products and outcomes, and also a flexible approach. I'd like you to a minute or two to reflect on whether or not you think that's actually the case. Now, the screen is going to change just while I press the layout button, because one of the things we're going to have a look at is a little activity, and I'm just going to put this full screen for you. And you've got two discussion boxes on the right of the PowerPoint, and what I'd like you to reflect on, and this, I'm going to give you 5 minutes to do this, and please be honest in here, because it's important that we share these ideas just as you would if you were actually in a face-to-face event and you were talking to me in person or talking to a colleague next to you. I want you to think about what have been the main advantages of controlled assessment, perhaps compared to coursework, or if you don't have an experience of coursework, what your experience of other ways of assessing fieldwork was, and what you found to be the most problematic areas as well. And clearly you've got lots of spaces to write those. Ideally we want a balance between kind of advantages and disadvantages, but I totally understand it if you're going to put lots into the problems and less into the advantages. Okay, so I'm going to give you 3 or 4 minutes to have a little type there. I'm going to come off mic. Just because it goes quiet doesn't mean that I've run away. It's just giving you time to think about this without me interfering with your sort of thought process. Okay, so 3 or 4 minutes for that first activity, and then I'll come back online again. Okay, I'm just going to come back on mic for a second or two just to prove that I've not deserted you. You've been a very good class here, writing lots and lots. Thank you for your informative and useful comments in here. I'm not going to read them all out because that would be tedious for all of us. I hope that you've had a chance to reflect on them. I'm just going to highlight some of the main features that have come through when we've run this as a face-to-face event in terms of the dominant things that people have found, so that you can either take some reassurance for that or reflect on it. The thing that has been, I think, the biggest barrier and the most problematic and challenging aspect of controlled assessment is 2 areas. One is about ICT access, which many of you have commented on, and this variability across schools and centres, and how actually that kind of ICT access, in some places is easy to manage, and in other places it's a real complicated task, or you can't get access to it. I don't think that's something that easily the awarding body can necessarily help you with. It's actually a bigger school issue, but I do think that 21st century education in geography does need to have some prominence here, but that's my own personal feeling about it. The other thing, which is perhaps a bigger challenge for people as well, is this sort of management of controlled assessment. The interpretations of how you manage high level of control and all those sorts of things, and low level of control, and making sure that colleagues are also doing it in the same way, and all those sorts of things. I think those have been the big issues that have come out about high level of control and, as I said before, ICT access as well. And I think perhaps linked into that high level of control, and again some of you have commented on this, is this feeling that we want to do our job as teachers, but at the same time we're kind of restricted from the support that we want to give, and it kind of goes against the grain, doesn't it, if you're a teacher, of not helping someone, and I know that that's problematic. I'm not sure really what the future of controlled assessment is. The government is due to report, or Ofqual rather, the regulator is due to report on controlled assessment before Christmas, and we may find that there are in the future some changes in terms of the way in which it's managed, even as soon possibly as, I don't know, 2014. But that's not for me to speculate. There's been nothing said yet, but you can see that perhaps this is on the radar. There has been some advantages though, and I'm glad that some of you reflected on that. One of you has said overall it's much better than coursework. I think for some schools it has been better. It hasn't dragged on, as you've said before, and it's also a more concentrated burst, and I think it's worked better for some learners. I think there are issues for some schools and some centres about time management and the degree of field work that you do. There's been a case in many examples, I think, where people have done perhaps too much field work, and that's led to a problem of fitting it all in terms of the write-up. And I think, again, some of you have commented quite rightly, it is a fairer and more equitable system probably than coursework as well. So let's not, as it were, throw the baby out with the bathwater in terms of reflecting on those things. And I've put in this PowerPoint a few reflections of myself, many of which I've talked about. I'm not going to go through them with you now because we've clearly dealt with them, but there are some benefits to controlled assessment. The other thing that I think has been a strength of our specification in particular is that many people have actually embraced this kind of GIS and visualization aspect, and that's created some quite innovative ways of working for several of our young people as well. But as I said to you before, the ICT issue has been a little bit problematic, I think. Now, one of the other things I'd like you just to sort of reflect on as well is the fieldwork styles, which you can see in this slide. Again, if you want to make this a bit bigger, press the full screen button. But just have a think about this. This is one of the slides I've used in face-to-face training. And it's just to get people to consider when they're setting up their fieldwork and managing their fieldwork, what is good, or what are the different ways of doing fieldwork. I think all too often we're pushed into, perhaps rightly or wrongly, fieldwork style B. And again, if you can't quite see what I'm talking about there, I'll just explain it on that slide if it's a bit small for you. But actually it's a very sort of what I think to be a mechanistic or even a reductionist approach to fieldwork, where we go out and we try and quantify everything, and we try and measure everything, and we try and make sure that the kids are always busy. And in effect, what they're doing is, in many cases, a task which is actually quite a low-level task. If it's a pedestrian count or whatever, it doesn't take a lot of skill to do that. I know that river measurement perhaps arguably is a bit more sophisticated. But I think because of the way in which awarding bodies and assessment works now, we've perhaps lost touch with A and B a bit more. A is this sort of Cook's tour fieldwork, and I think that one of the relevant things about fieldwork with young people is it doesn't always lead to an outcome which is based on controlled assessment. It may actually be an opportunity for teaching some theory, for exposing awe and wonder, and it's just an excuse to go and visit a different place and actually be doing your field work in an inspiring location and taking students to somewhere which is off their radar, different, contrasting, all those sorts of things. And I do think even in the 21st century, 2012, there is still a place for things like field sketches. Now, it doesn't necessarily have to be done with a piece of paper and a blank sheet, but actually it can be something whereby you have a piece of work which is being used sort of as a supporting role in a tablet, and there are many apps out there if you're into technology where you can do that. So please think of fieldwork as being a range of ways of different teaching and learning styles, and I think that may lead to a more successful outcome in terms of controlled assessment. Now I'm just going to flick to activity 2. The booklet will change, the screen will change for you slightly, and what we've got in activity 2 is something slightly different for you to do here. There is a booklet on screen, and in a second or two I'm going to give you control over this. It's a PDF document which comes in the pack as well. It's one of my colleagues' schools, and they don't mind me using this, which is why it's been named, and I'm totally trying to use it as a kind of good teaching and learning exercise. Actually, what it is their fieldwork booklet that they give their students when they go out, and it's based on our 2012 task. You can see the link there: urban areas, good, bad, and ugly. I'm sure many of you have actually done that. What I want you to do is have a reflect on this booklet, as if you were doing a bit of an audit of it. And actually, I've run this course. I've run this on a face-to-face event. We can do something very similar now with you using the sort of the typing facility that we have. So what I want you to have a look at is what you liked about the booklet. What are the areas particularly of good practice? You may even want to give a specific page reference in a minute or two. And then some of the areas that you thought that you might have changed if you were to set this piece of field work up as well. What did you not like about the booklet, or what did you find that may have been problematic about it? Now, we haven't got hours and hours to do this, but certainly we've got, I would have thought, 6 or 7 minutes to have a look at this. You can't do this very, very instantly. Now, I'm going to unsync this document. So what that basically means is you now have control over it, and you can scroll it up or down. You can't make it actually taller. It's because of the layout of the window that you've got. If you've downloaded the pack already, you may be looking at it at a different monitor or something like that. But if you've not, you can use the interactivity that we have on the facility in Connect, Adobe Connect, and you can zoom it in and out. You haven't got time to look at every page in a vast amount of detail, but what you have got time to do, I hope, is to review some of this and to pick out the good practice and areas where you might have changed it. And I think it's an interesting discussion document. So again, I'm going to come off microphone and just briefly have a pause. I've got a nice cup of tea in front of me, so I shall have a little slurp of that. And I'll come back on mic in about 6 or 7 minutes. Or if you feel that you've had sufficient time on this, please put, I don't know if you can see the attendees list, please, I think you can probably raise your hand even though you can't see the attendees list. So if you think you've had enough time on it, put your hand in the air or give me a tick or something like that to indicate that, or even write it in the comments box. Yeah, thank you, move on type thing, and that'll give me the signal. But otherwise, sort of 6 or 7 minutes to have a go at this. Okay, folks, I'm going to do a little bit more talking for a minute. I think that the fact that some of you have raised your hands in the attendee box, even though you probably can't see it, means that you probably had enough of doing this, or or you think, yeah, let's have a little look at them. Now, clearly there are lots and lots of comments, and again, I'm not going to necessarily read them all out, or necessarily even reflect on all of them. I'm going to share my experience of running this as a face-to-face event with you when we did exactly the same activity, and indeed there was a high degree of parallelness, if that's the right word, or similarity between the comments you've written and what my delegates on the face-to-face events. I think overall that it's a good practice, a solid way of approaching this particular task. What I particularly liked from it, and my colleagues who I work with in a face-to-face context, was actually it did a very good, and I'm just going to take this off sync so I can tell you, show you rather what I'm talking about. I think it did a good setting up job at the beginning. I think that's one of its strengths. So at the beginning they have on the first page the task that we set from Edexcel, so it's clear to the students what it is they're doing. I'm convinced that many students don't actually ever see the task from Edexcel, or they think it's just sort of tangential to what they're doing and they're doing something slightly different. I think it's very important to root your whole methodology, your whole approach into the task. So I thought that was good practice. There is also a high degree of structure here, and this second bit where it says the exam board have given us a task title, what could it mean, I think is a very useful way of contextualizing it or deconstructing it. Now I think many of you, and perhaps I think that your comments are valid, are slightly concerned about the fact that perhaps the students have been rather too led in this, and therefore it's a bit prescribed. I saw those kind of comments coming through. My own feeling is that actually, in terms of setting this up, it does allow for some differentiation, even if you do feel this is highly structured, because again, having seen the work from this centre, not everyone understood totally what it is they were meant to do. And again, some mixed comments from some of you. Some of you felt that one of the disadvantages with this is, it was too high level, i.e., how could the lower ability students understand what was going on? Whereas some other people commented on this was too structured and giving them too much of a scaffold. I think you have to think about this from your learner's perspective. What is it that you are trying to set out to achieve, and how do you want to support them? In an ideal world, you might have 2 levels of support, I suspect, differentiated for kind of higher and foundation. The school hasn't done this. This is a one-size-fits-all, and in some contexts that means it doesn't necessarily work. But what I do think you should take from this is that there is some good geography being explored. We have got social and economic and environmental being discussed in this booklet that we have here, and that's particularly important in terms of making sure that you are you're sort of familiar with, also the kids are familiar with the geography that's trying to be examined here, and I think that's good practice. The other thing I think I'd like to draw your attention to is at the bottom, where I'm just scrolling on this page, is the way in which it's been set up into 3 study areas, which would be sensible for something like this. It's manageable, but they are based on census output area codes. And again, if you're not familiar with this in terms of your geography, then I do think as a professional geographer you need to get your head into it, because actually a lot of the what I might call geodemographic data is actually derived from census data, and basically these output areas that you can see on here, they are geographically put together to provide postcode data, and they're actually very, very important for for telling marketing companies and things like that what sort of people live in certain areas. But you can access all of this data. There's a website which is called censusprofiler.org, for instance, which would be very useful, or you go in through the National Statistics website and go to their neighbourhood statistics section to access this. So I would strongly recommend that for any I suppose, human geography type thing. You are accessing this sort of data because actually looking at the good, the bad and the ugly is not just a question of going around and doing a litter survey and an environmental quality. I think if you're a thinking geographer, then you have to approach it from a research point of view as well as a fieldwork point of view as well. There are, of course, some criticisms that you've come on to as well. That some other things that you've mentioned about. I think that some of us said they don't think it's challenging enough for high-level students. I'm not sure I agree with that. I think there is a high degree of challenge really in some of this material. I would say that my overall criticism with this, and I think some of you are actually alluding to this, is that there is too much in terms of the range of data collection methods. Now, I'm not sure of the background, or I can't remember the background of how this is set up, but if you were expecting every student to do all of this different range, so we've got taking photos, we've got land use mapping, we've got environmental quality surveys, we've then got building quality surveys, field sketches, what else is there on here? Shops and services count. I'm sure there were some things in here, but they probably there's space for their field sketches. Shops and services, then soundscapes. That's actually quite an interesting bit of field work, by the way. We ought to have a look at that after this session. And then we've got a questionnaire. Now, all of these in their own right, I think, are valid. But what I have a slight issue about, so it's not an issue, that's too strong a word. What I have a slight reservation about is if all the students are expected to write up all of these different things, then there would be a problem in terms of manageability. There is too much data, and it basically means that particularly for the weaker students, they get lost in all the numbers. And actually we want to look at good, bad and ugly, and whilst we might have measured some of the things that are in the field in a reasonably proficient way, we don't necessarily have to measure 8 or 9 things. I hope you can kind of agree with what I'm saying here. I think this is a good structure, but I have reservations about the range of field work that they should be doing. Now, if the school came back to me and said, actually, we got individual students to pick 3 of these methods and then to adapt them to their particular fieldwork task or whatever it was, or their particular fieldwork focus, then I'd say that's really good teaching and learning. And many of you, or sorry, one of you has commented in the textbook that actually when you give them questionnaires, you get them to design their own or modify those, and I think that's very, very good practice. But I hope as an activity, it's something that you would find worthwhile reflecting on. Have a look at that, and if you don't do support booklets for students, then I think, to be honest, you are perhaps missing a trick, because I do think we're not in any way telling them, I don't think we're I don't know, I've got to be careful the words I use here, but I don't think we're giving them a high degree of assistance here. What we're doing is trying to support them in terms of a teaching and learning outcome, and to let them and help them perform to their best ability. And I think that in the context of controlled assessment, that is very, very reasonable. Okay, before I waffle on too much about that, I'm going to go back to the presentation, but thank you for your comments. I hope it was useful to sort of consider those. We're now going to go into the main bit of what we were talking about today, which is standardization. And this is very important in 2 ways. The first slide that we've got here, remember, if you want to make it bigger, we certainly can. The first slide that we've got here is a slide which looks at what is internal standardization. These are extracts, I think, from the specification. There's a difference between internal and external standardization. And I know some of you are sending in questions. I'll come to those actually shortly. But in terms of internal standardization, what we want you to do is feel confident in applying the mark scheme in a standardized way. That's what we want you to do. And it's about consistency and what we term as an agreed level. Now, what that means that we think you should do in an ideal situation, I hasten to add, in an ideal situation, is that if you're in a department where there are more than one of you, I'll come back to what happens if you're a kind of solo, but if you're in a department with more than one of you, you should be thinking about meeting before you go out and do your field work to agree what it is you're going to do in terms of the field work, and to make sure that you all understand what the task is about, and that, you know, when in terms of the field work itself, your planned field work is going to work successfully. That's just common sense, really. And then the second activity is, once the field work has been done, then you actually consider how you're going to meet up again to standardise your marks. Now, before that can happen, you need to individually mark a selection of field work. I would suggest that you're talking about 3 or 4 pieces of work, probably at the grade boundaries that you might anticipate. So if you look at historic data for this specification, you'll see that the grade boundaries are about 42 for an A star, 38 for an A, 34, something like that, for a B, and then go down sequentially. You can get all this data off the Edexcel website. But what I would suggest you do is you pick a kind of A star piece of work, a C grade, and then if you've got something down at the D or the E grade, you pick that and you bring that to the meeting. You then, in the process of standardization, all agree what the marks are. And what that should mean in your department is that you are all then standardized, i.e. you're marking to the same level. Now, the reason that's so important is that what we sometimes come across in our external moderation is teachers in the same department giving different marks for effectively the same piece of work, if that makes sense. And that creates a real headache for us in terms of any mark adjustment, because if one teacher's up and another one's down, then it means that some students have been adversely affected by that. You may have been we particularly don't want those students who've been marked down to be penalised in any way. So that internal standardisation is important. And then if I move on to the next slide, which is this external standardisation, I'm not going to read out all of the green blurb, but it's about making sure that the work that we see from your schools is actually also at agreed level. And really, to be honest, what the external standardisation is about is actually, it's not about remarking your work. It's what we call standardizing it, or moderating it. It's a slightly different process, but it's actually hopefully a checking and a feedback service, and we really do try and to the best of our ability to give you feedback on those, I can't remember what they're called, those forms, but you get them at the end of the summer, which actually provides you a hope with a kind of an indication of where you might be going slightly awry. Now, if you're a solo, i.e. you're a one-man band in your department, you clearly can't do that internal standardization. I would strongly suggest that you try and hook up with someone locally and convene a meeting at a time convenient to you both, where you can do this, so you share centres. Equally, that would work if you are perhaps you're new to teaching this spec and you're in a department where you're new head of department and you're not quite sure of how to apply the mark scheme. It is very, very important that you get a bit of confidence in terms of applying the mark scheme and making sure that all of those things that we're discussing really are correctly applied. And as I said before, we have a problem if we have effectively non-consistent marking from the centre. What do we do? Do we push it up or push it down? And when examiners, our moderators rather, when they look at your pieces of work, I think you have to believe us when I say to you, we're not looking to change work. We're looking to confirm the agreed standard. I.e., what that means is that we like you, have an interpretation of the mark scheme, and we want to make sure that on a national level you are marking the same, or as best as you can do that, as we can manage it, as a school down the road, so that there's no unfair advantage conferred to any particular students. I hope that makes sense to you. Now, just while I'm talking, I'll just have a quick look at some of the questions that have come through, and I hope that these will make sense. So I'm talking to you and trying to read the questions at the same time, and I hope this, I think some of you are communicating with each other, to be honest. I don't know whether you can help me here, Chloe. I can't seem to open the questions, or whether or not I'm just doing something wrong. It's not expanding the message properly. I'll probably be able to sort this out in the break. perhaps some of you have got some other questions. Oh, here we are. Sorry. How can we find? Someone's asked a question. How can we find local centres? I'm a new head of department to the spec. Well, one of the things we're going to have here is that the last slide at the end is a kind of opportunity for networking, and there is a slide built into this PowerPoint at the end where you can get each other's email addresses if you put them in. What we're not allowed to do at Excel or Inset Online is we're not allowed to say, right, write your email addresses in here and we'll copy them and email them out to you because of data protection. You may notice that I'm being cautious about it. I'm not mentioning any of your main names deliberately. It's not because I'm being impersonal. It's because all of this is recorded and we want to protect your anonymity. I know that sounds a bit crazy, but that's the way it works. So we'll give you an opportunity at the end for networking and to make sure that that kind of process actually works as well. Someone's also said, I thought this is a free event. Would it be available to use as our team so our department is logged in? I think that's the case. It's being recorded. You can go back in at any time and to make sure that you are able to. Sorry, I'm trying to read the answer. I'm trying to read someone else's question at the same time I'm talking to you. I'll stop doing that because I'm a bloke. I can't multitask. I'll read the question out again. I thought this is a free event and would be available to us and our team so the department is logged in. That's correct. I think it is a free event, and because it's being recorded you should be able to access the recording at your leisure. It probably is available, I think, for about a month or so after the event has happened. So therefore, when we get to the page in the PowerPoint presentation, which is the end, where you put in your names and your email addresses, you can get someone else's from that, if that makes sense. Okay, so I hope that those are, those kind of questions are being answered, and I'm doing my best to do that, to be honest. Now, it's about 10 to 5, and I think it's probably a good idea. I'm just going to look what the next slide is. It's probably a good idea to have a little break for a minute here, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring on activity 3 over the break, if you don't mind me doing this. And the screen has gone a bit funny again for you here, and you've got more homework to do over your tea and coffee break. It may be that we can actually wrap this session up a bit before 6 o'clock, which perhaps will please some of you. I'm not sure. We're going through going great guns at the moment, and you're communicating well, and I hope you're getting something out of it. Now, on this screen, what there is a piece of work. It's a real piece of work. It's blanked off so we can try and protect the student's anonymity. And what I want you to do is to have a go at marking it. Now, in terms of doing this, if you're sat with other colleagues in the room, please talk to each other when you do this, because it makes it a lot easier. If you're not sat with other colleagues, please don't think this is a test. It is a fairly good piece of work, to be honest. It's certainly not 20 out of 50. We've got the mark scheme for you, which is the legacy mark scheme, the one you're familiar with, I hope. And again, I think for some of you who are perhaps new to this will be a useful exercise. But what I want you to do is I'm going to give you a break, and then probably a couple of minutes after the break to do this, so you've got time to reflect on it. I'd like you to do two things. A, which is to give a total mark for it at the end. That means you've got to mark it in terms of the criteria, add those criteria, and then we've got some bands for you. And the second thing I want you to do is any comments relating to this piece of work, whether they're positive or negative, or how you found they've done it. And I think that will be useful for people. Okay, so those are the things you've got to do. You're going to give it a mark, and ideally you're going to give it a mark breakdown. I'm going to ask Chloe in a second or two to make sure that everything is synchronized, rather, so that you can scroll the PDF documents up and down and zoom them in and out. I appreciate this screen is a little bit cluttered. There's a lot of things for you to do, but I hope it makes sense. If you printed this off or got it on another computer, then possibly it's a bit easier. For some of you, though, you'll be working on this screen. So as I promised before, a quick break. It's now 16:51 on my computer. We'll come back in about 10 minutes time, so it'll just be a 1 minute after 5 o'clock, and then we'll perhaps, if you need it, give you a couple more minutes to reflect on this, but otherwise we'll have a look at this example. Okay folks, I'm just going to come in now and make a few comments about the piece of work. I'm first of all going to show you, I think, in a second or two, the voting. I reckon there's 2 or 3 of you still left to vote if you can, so I'll come back to that in a minute or two. Let me just make a few answers to some of the comments that you've put, and it's useful you're using this as a way of asking me things as well. One of the things that someone has asked is that the last column in the methods table, and I know it's very common for students now to do these methods table, how do you sort of manage it, interpret it? There's nothing wrong with putting an evaluation in the methods table. I think it's slightly clear. I think actually it's something that's a legacy of the old coursework, but anyway, personally I think it's slightly clearer if you can put the evaluation in the evaluation section, and it declutters it. Technically, of course, evaluation is something that's done under high level of control rather than limited. I don't have a problem with it going in the methods section as long as you can be assured that that student has done that work individually. But I think actually it's easier for you to mark and for the student to manage if you just save it all up to the end. And the other drawback, of course, is putting it in the methods table is they tend to repeat it again. They tend to repeat the methods table comments again at the end of the section. You know, like I couldn't answer all the questionnaires because it was raining or whatever it is. You know those sort of excuses that come across. So that's useful. The other thing as well, which is a comment here about the I suppose about this piece of work, that I'll just make the comment that someone said at the beginning, is there seems to be a lot of data presentation techniques, and there are indeed, and perhaps when we look at this in a little bit more detail in a second or two, we can certainly sort of reflect on that. But actually, the data presentation techniques, I think what you need to be rewarding is good practice, high quality geography, and to make sure that the geography that you are giving the marks for is not 3 different types of donut graph. And I know someone has already mentioned that, but in fact that you're giving high marks for good quality data presentation, whether that be in some way sophisticated or original or just well presented because you've got mini located pies or whatever it is on a base map. We tend at the moment not to be specific about that idea of range of data, and I know one of the issues perhaps people have had with our mark scheme is, what do you mean by range? I think that range depends on what you're doing in terms of your coursework or controlled assessment field work. It's probably easier to do a load of graphs if you collect 5 different variables in the river which are numerically arranged than it is to come up with 3 different types of original way of, or innovative way or good ways of presenting data that you might have collected in a kind of human context. So I think you have to be the professional judge of that. We're going to make some instructions or give you some guidance for our new mark scheme, which changes in 2014, or you'll be using in 2014 for the new spec, and to try and clarify some of these things for you. Now let me just broadcast the results. I think most of you have had an opportunity to look at those, and I'm just going to make the chat box slightly smaller so you can see what people are giving in terms of that. I hope Chloe, who's our host, is impressed that I can do that. The total marks that you've given this, it's not a test on whether or not you can put the right number on it. Let me just tell you what the school put on it, and then I'm going to give you my interpretation. The school put 45 on this, which I think most of you were in that right area. Whether this is a 45 or not is a slightly moot point. If I was marking it the first time round, I wouldn't have put such a high mark on it. I would be in the band 40 to 43, but I would be near the top of that band, and indeed that's where most of you are. I think it represents just about an A star. So to me, it's more of a flavour of a piece of work at 42 or 43. It's definitely an A star in my mind. I think if you go below that kind of 40 mark, then I think you're being too harsh on it. A couple of you have been there. Just sort of reassess those sorts of marks. The things, actually, if I just unsynchronize it so you can see what I'm talking about, the things that I think are quite good about it at the beginning are, it's got a map here showing us where we went. They've been to Corfe Castle, if I believe correctly, and done some field work there. This is GIS. Well, it's actually visualization. It's not proper GIS, but it counts for GIS. Many of you have commented on the fact that you're doing more sophisticated. I'd give you a big round of applause, or a virtual round of applause, so that you can, we want to encourage that. We want to actually, in the future, sort of support people in using proper GIS, whether it's sort of the Esri versions of those. They've got some clear aims that they're setting up, and those aims do relate to the task that they're meant to be doing. I think one of the things you can gauge by this is that it's a highly structured piece of work, and this student has been involved in a process whereby they've been taken to a good place to do this piece of field work, i.e. it works, and they've followed instructions clearly, and therefore there is lots of geography that's coming through. I know that you can't read this on your screen in front of you, I'm just scrolling through it. I like the justifications at the beginning of why they're doing that. They also have some background research, and they use social, environmental, economic. There's lots of geography coming through. You don't necessarily have to do 3 or 4 pages of introduction at the beginning, but it's always nice to see I think, some information which actually reflects on what it is, the task that you're looking at. So it doesn't just become I'm going to go to the river and have a look at how wide and how deep it is, but it's more of a, well, we went to look at this river because rivers are important from the context of, I don't know, flooding, very topical where I live at the moment, and sort of water resource management. So they get the bigger picture. I think that's important, and it's good geography. So I always encourage those sorts of things. Again, perhaps one of the things that you might have commented on or thought about is the range of data collection that they're doing here. There is a large range of data collection, and that has led them in some instances to produce a lot of different types of graphs. I'm not sure of the value of lots of different pie charts. Now, we have some pie charts here. This is percentage of certain types of dwellings in Corfe Castle and Wool, and I can't read the rest of the other place, and Swanage. These are all villages, aren't they, close by, or small towns close by. The fact that they've done them in different colours and things really doesn't impress me, and it doesn't impress you, I don't suppose, but there are some good bits of practice here. For instance, I quite like the overlaid map of Swanage tourists to the beach and away from the beach. It shows a little bit of innovation, and I think the fact that not all the students in this cohort did this, because I saw the rest of the work from the centre, is something to be commended. But there is a lot of the same, and I don't think we want to give really high marks, top of this band, for loads of repetitive graphs. We are after quality here, and I think some of you have alluded to that in terms of your mark band criteria. I sort of have deep intakes of breath when I see the donut graphs. I'm not a great fan of those, and then there might be 3D presentations of those. The radar plots seem to work reasonably well. Remember, the purpose of data presentation is to make the data easy for someone else to understand. It's not to see how many different buttons you can press in Excel to create, and that page there has come out as an error, but it's not to see how many different ways you can make up of presenting the same data. We then go into the analysis. The analysis is pretty strong, but it's not top of the top band analysis. It tends in some places to be a bit more descriptive. So in terms of where this student has lost marks, they've lost a few marks for their data presentation and possibly their analysis, and also I think their conclusions in places could have been a bit stronger. I think they've done a reasonable job on their evaluation, and there are some nice reflections on here that you may have got time to sort of look at. So to me, this represents a good-ish piece of work. Sorry, it's not a good-ish. It's a good piece of work at about the bottom of the A-star standard. But I don't think you should. It's not a resigning issue for someone who's given it 45, but I don't think I would want to be giving it 47 and above. Okay, so I've given you my sort of reflection on this. Clearly this process is much easier to do if we meet face to face, but I think I've given you a chance to have a look at it. Now, there is, in fact, another activity to do based on the same sort of thing. So I'm just going to go back to the presentation. So you've had to put the numbers on that one. We then have activity 4, which is looking at controlled assessment example 2 and applying the existing mark scheme. Now, this one, I'll just change the screen again. This one is a piece of work, same sort of thing, which has been moderated. So in a minute or two, we're going to give you the opportunity to look at this piece of work. Remember, you can download all of these. What I want you to do is to say whether or not you feel comfortable with this mark, and you've got basically got, thanks Chloe, you've basically got the opportunity to say yes or no. It's not mind-bending at 5:15 on a whatever day we're on today, Wednesday. That's not really, you know, whether you agree with it or not is in a way is almost irrelevant. I want you to go away with a sort of a comfort blanket here. Are you happy with the mark that has been given in terms of that? The fact that you may agree with 47 may not be actually indicative of accurate marking in all sections, because often what you find is that perhaps some sections have been overmarked or some have been undermarked. Therefore, you've got to take a little bit of time to reflect on this. Now, in a second or two, Chloe, if you can give over to control to the delegates for both the mark scheme, thank you, and also the assessment criteria, they can have another 5 or 10 minutes to reflect on this. So you're becoming an external moderator now. Do you think the mark stands? And I would also be interested on your thoughts as to actually, do you think this is better or worse than the previous one you've looked at? It's clearly a very, very long piece of work. It runs to 63 pages. And therefore it's a big piece of work. I'll be able to answer that question for you in a second, Steve. When I stop talking, I'll put it on the screen for you. I think, Steve, the evaluation mark was probably 4 or 5, but I'll check on it for you, Steve. Sorry, I've mentioned your name. I hope you don't mind being mentioned in one of these presentations. I don't think you would. Steve too, that could be lots and lots of people. I'll check the mark for you and type it up for you, Steve, in there. But while I'm doing that, have a reflection on this piece of work that you've got in front of you in terms of whether or not you agree with it. Okay. And I'll also comment, the next person who's put there in terms of the clarification about the word count, and there's a 63 pages. Yeah, I'll come back to that in a minute or two. Ignore that for a second. Have a look at the piece of work. Okay, so I'll come off mic, and then 7 or 8. You have to be a speed reader, won't you? But 7 or 8 minutes should do the job on it. If you're new to this, the way I would look at it and get a reaction as to whether I think the mark is right, I would first of all look at the introduction, and I would turn straight to the evaluation at the end. And I think that gives me a fairly good idea about what standard this is at. Okay, folks, I'm going to come on and make one or two comments about this piece of work. And again, I don't have time, nor do you, to read all 63 pages of what we have in front of us. It's clearly a long piece of work, and I'll talk about the word limit and the word length in a minute or two. Before I get to that, let me just quickly broadcast the results for what you have in terms of agree, disagree. So most of you feel that you couldn't agree with the original marks. Now, we have a degree of tolerance, which is a published degree of tolerance of plus or minus 3 marks based on the work that's sent in as a standard. And so what you've got to be thinking about, and perhaps I didn't clarify that at the beginning, but I think it's fair enough to sort of think about it now, is do you think you can live with if you think it's overmarked, do you think it's worth 44? Now, one of the things that we see as moderators is the overall centre cohort. Now, the interesting thing is when I compare the previous one to what we have here, is that in the previous centre, all of the students were scoring a very similar mark. So they were all getting, 43, 44, 45, 46. Now that, to me, indicates that the centre is managing their fieldwork very successfully, and you've got a fairly willing group of students to write it up in the way in which you sort of instruct them to. Whereas this student, this was by far the best piece of work from the school that we're talking about here. It had a big tail on it, went all the way down to effectively G grade. And one of the things I think you have to think about is that these students who are being, I suppose, judged on this, to what extent is it their own work, and how is the controlled assessment being managed? Now, clearly, we set out our guidance and our guidelines for controlled assessment, but people have varying degrees of interpretation, and I don't necessarily want to go into all of that now. But I think probably as an individual, this student here has fairly well understood in most instances what it is they're meant to be talking about. And I might argue in terms of this control assessment, this is actually quite a complex task. It's the 21st century shopping one, I think, if I can remember correctly. And in terms of looking at that, they're actually trying to tackle that in a kind of a way which is a geographer's way. Now, there is a huge issue, I think, with the length of the piece of work, as you've said. The piece of work is, grossly over length, but you have to remember, even in our existing mark scheme, there is no direct penalty for over length work. Therefore, the teacher shouldn't be taking marks off for over length work, nor should we as moderators. We don't say, right, it's -3 because it's over length. I would have to assume, because this is what we do assume, that the controlled assessment has been carried out as per the guidance that we have recommended, i.e. it's been done in approximately the right number of hours that we've suggested, and because the teachers signed the front of it, I anticipate that has been the case. You may feel, based on your background of doing this, that that's not been the case, but we're not in a position to pass judgment on this. So I'm thinking the conditions of controlled assessment are correct, and also that the student has done it in the way in which we would anticipate that they've done it, because I don't have any other evidence that suggests that that's not been the case based on the other pieces of work that I see from the centre. Now, clearly, if I was working with this student at the introduction, one of the first things I would have done would have been to say to them, right, we need to make this whole thing a bit more manageable, and it's just far too long, and all those sorts of things. But actually, when you read some of this and you read between the lines of what the student is saying, I think, and this is my own professional judgment on this, and that's just because I've had quite a lot of time to reflect on this piece of work, and you're doing it in a kind of closed meeting environment, I think this student knows more about the geography of what they're talking about in this piece of work than the previous student. And you may think that's a fairly bold statement for me to sort of make at this point, but actually when you pull apart the geography of what they're talking about, and actually I think the complexity of the kind of 21st century high street idea, which actually they do talk about, and they do reflect on some of this in their sessions, or sorry, in their evaluation at the end, it's been done in a very different way. Now, clearly, perhaps the high level of control has been handwritten, and that's how a lot of centres do it, because they don't have access to IT, and therefore that means that the student is having to handwrite it, and that to some extent is a disadvantage for some students. Whereas the other school that we had, all their students had access to IT. It makes the process easier. Now, we can't judge a student based on whether they can have access to IT or not. We should be giving it from a level field. But actually, when you begin to read, and you've not had the opportunity for doing this in depth, what this student has written, and this is why I did a double take on it when I first saw this piece of work. When I read through the work again, I actually managed to pick out some strands of evaluation, for instance, which weren't in the evaluation section, but they were reflected on in other parts of the work, and you've got to be prepared to carry those evaluation marks forward. And I do think that they actually come to reflect in a more meaningful way than probably the previous student has done, because the previous student has kind of followed a recipe for evaluation that I suspect they've been told by their teacher. But I liked the so if I think I'm right here, Chloe, so everyone can see the page that I'm on. If I just synchronize this with you, this page here, which is the Reading as a town centre, the area of influence of Reading they talk about here is shown by Richard Ellis. This shows blah blah blah, as far afield as London and all those sorts of things. This actually, I think, is kind of beginning to try and pull together some of the geography, and they sort of try and bring in here the demographic data. And actually I felt that they were doing a better tying in job than the previous student here. Now they do talk about, you know, if I'd had more time kind of thing, I would have repeated to it. But I do think that they do reflect on the sort of the deeper meaning of what the future of Reading actually is. And I think we have to be prepared to credit our evaluation as being a job of tying in together. Now, again, you don't have the time, or it's not an easy environment for looking at this piece of work in any great level of detail because of the constraints of what we've got. But I hope that you can agree with me that I wouldn't have personally pulled that piece of work out of tolerance based on what I saw. I can get the marks to pretty much be at A-star standard. Now, I don't think it's worth 47. But I do think it's worth probably a 43 or a 44, and I think there's a lot of good geography in there. You have to be more of you have to look for the geography in a different way to the one that you saw previously. The one that you saw previously was kind of very mechanistic in their approach, and had actually done a job on it which makes for easy reading. Whereas this student here, there's a good geographer in here. They're probably not quite as good as the previous geographers expressing themselves, and they've not had the opportunity for the IT, and they've perhaps not been as guided as the previous student. So there's a lot of stuff in here that you could have pulled out. But actually, in terms of when we're trying to assess how well this student has understood that task, well, for me, I think this is a good student that we've got here, and I think that we should be prepared to credit that. And the purpose of moderation is not just to be, a person who sort of looks at things and thinks, oh yeah, I'm happy with that, I'm not happy with that. But we have to, as external moderators, sorry, I've just banged my watch on the table, we have to, as external moderators, take a reflective view of the whole centre, because actually, if I'd suddenly looked at this and there's the way in which the computer reorders marks, if I'd said, right, I think this is worth 40 out of 47, and I find that this is out of tolerance, and I find another one out of tolerance, what it would have meant is that all of those students may have found their marks depressed by, let's say, 3 raw marks, something like that. Now, for the students in the C, D and E grade boundary, that would have been a very unfair decision to have made, because they would have found themselves probably a grade down on where they should have been. Now, this is the job that you have to do back at your school. And if you actually find that one of your colleagues, for instance, has given a piece of work like this, 47, well, you actually may be thinking, hang on, we need to make sure that this is not really a 47, it's more like a 43, 44, but we wouldn't disadvantage the rest of the cohort in terms of pulling down their marks because of that. This is I think what I'm trying to get over to you in a fairly illogical way, but I hope you agree with where I'm coming from. The purpose of standardization is about making judgment calls. We're dealing with a semi-quantitative scoring system, and we can all argue the toss on whether something is 6 or 7 out of 8 or whatever it is. We have strong feelings, but actually it's about looking at the overall quality of a piece of work in many instances and making a judgment call on that as well. Okay, right, I'm going to move back to the presentation. There are 2 other pieces of work in the pack for download, and I know one of you said, can we download these pieces of work? Well, you can download them when we go back to the welcome page, because it's got the zip file on it. We'll go back there at the end. I'm sorry, as part of our presentation, you can see it here, sorry, it's in the bottom of the thing, you can download it from this page, but where we were in the previous one, it's not possible to do that. So for that centre which wanted to do that, it's a straightforward zip file exercise, to be honest. Now, one of you has asked, can we find out our local centres? I think I've answered that one. Another one is, I'm struggling to download. I think Chloe will perhaps give you some instructions in a window in a minute or two if that's not right. I think what all you have to do is click on that zip pack, and it takes you to basically a web page where you download it. I hope it's fairly straightforward to do it, but again, if you stay on the line at the end of the session, if you're struggling with it, Chloe can give you some technical support in terms of being able to do that. Now, the other 2 pieces of work that we have here that you also have in the zip file, and I don't think probably there's time to go into these in any too great detail, but I'll just talk them through with you, are two other examples. One which is an example which is a kind of C grade example, which I wanted to give you, because otherwise what we do is we concentrate on giving you kind of A-star pieces of work, and clearly not all students are A-star. So you've got a copy of that and you've got the marks, and we're in agreement with it. So example 3 in your pack is a kind of C grade piece of work that you can download and have a time to reflect on. Example 4 is slightly different to that, and that is again a full download in your pack, but it's a different one because it's a different end product. And what this particular school did, and they had a history of doing this under a previous specification, they transported it to our spec, but what they did was they get the students to write effectively the low level of control stuff up in a normal way. So they've done a rivers piece of work, you'll see, in Wales, and they write it up in the normal way. So, and then when they get to their presentation, they then do something which I think is quite innovative and creative and works for that particular school. Is what they do is they get the students to do a presentation, and they do a presentation tying together all of the presentation and the analysis and the results and the conclusion and the evaluation, and they present that to their teachers. So actually the only writing that they do is the front end of the route to inquiry plus the PowerPoint that supports the presentation that they're making. Now, there's teachers are quite, because they're used to doing this, are quite able to make judgments on both the written material and the PowerPoint, and there is a copy of the PowerPoint in the download for you, so you can see what they've done there. The teachers are not making judgments on the quality of presentation. They're making judgments on the quality of the geography which is being talked about. Now, this is, I don't think I'm letting any secrets out here, this is an all-boys school, and to be honest, the cohort in this boys' school much prefer that style of presentation, because basically they have to write less and they're not particularly keen on writing loads and loads. They would prefer to do a presentation, and there is a history of doing presentations in Key Stage 3, so they're quite familiar with it. It's not a presentation where it's all gloss over substance. It's a high quality presentation. This is an A grade piece of work you're looking at, or A star, I believe, example 4. There's some very good geography coming through to it, but for that particular school, that management of the high level of control and all those other things works well for them. And again, what I want you to be convinced about is that we are supportive, or Pearson Edexcel is supportive in terms of the way in which you might choose to write up various sections to encourage a flexible approach to learning. And you know, that is, I think, important to recognise that we can do that for you. And if you're in any doubt about whether or not it's appropriate, please use the Ask the Expert service. You know how to get in touch with us, and we'll give you some comments and some feedback and some guidance and all those sorts of things. But I wanted to show you just those two examples because I think they're useful, and they are clearly something which is worthwhile you having, and I want to share with you, and we've used them in the face-to-face events as well. So I'm not going to go through them now. They're just something for you to reflect on. And again, if you feel you need to come back to me about a bit more things about how they did the example 4, use the Ask the Expert service. If it's a Spec B controlled assessment query, it normally comes to me directly anyway. I'll be able to reflect on it with you. There is also some other things in the presentation which are, again, very quickly worth talking about. GIS and visualization. There's a support document on the Edexcel website which talks about this for you. We've long held, or certainly I've held the belief, that this kind of stuff is very important for 21st century geography. There is a big spectrum between GIS and visualization. The images that you have on this slide in front of you are not proper GIS. There's Google Maps, there's Google Bing, and there's a screenshot from the EA's flood website of Shrewsbury, which would be very upside at the moment because it's actually in flood, I believe, at the moment. Anyway, I digress. Some people are at this stage of just doing this, while others of you I know are at a much more proficient stage. If you are proficient, go for it. I'd encourage you to do that. If you're at this stage of just doing a screenshot, then don't beat yourself up about it. It's a learning curve. It may be restrictions because of IT access or because of your own professional development. Whatever it is, I don't have a problem with that. We are pretty I think we're pretty aware that there is this great variability in GIS, so we don't want to knock marks down, but you do have to make an effort to make at least this kind of technology available for your students. And I feel that any incarnation in the future of a GCSE specification or EBC will have a stronger element of GIS in it. It's something that the RGS certainly want to build in than we have previously. So it's going to be something which is not going to go away. And actually, GIS for me is at the heart of good quality teaching and learning, and you know, I feel quite strongly about it. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry, and there are, you know, huge organisations which use it all the time. And to be honest, you know, if you're a geography graduate, or you know, you're someone who does geography now, then you're actually not trained in using Google Earth, I don't think, at university. You'd be trained in using a proper platform like ArcGIS. And I think as geography teachers, we've got to kind of come round to that, and we have to tool ourselves up to it. But it's clearly a learning curve as well. There are more sophisticated ways of using GIS. These are a couple of examples from the Field Studies Council. I wouldn't anticipate everyone would either want to do this or would have the skill set to do it. It's still not proper GIS, by the way, it's a visualization. But there are some creative things that actually people are beginning to do. So GIS is important, and again, if you've got queries about it, we're going to try and run some GIS courses, I think, next year. It's one of the things I'd like Pearson to offer you. I don't know whether they'd be free or paid for. I'm not in a position to say that, but we are aware it's on the radar. So anyway, our activities now, in terms of looking at this, I'm just going to change the screen again to go to activity 5, because this is an interesting one about the 2,000 word limit. Now there's two things going on this screen here. We've got access to our 2015, sorry, not 2015, they've not been written, 2014 tasks. These are submission. This is under the new specification, whereas you know there will be a 2,000 word limit. Now if you read the spec, as I'm sure most of you have, you'll notice it's not word for word what I've written in the question. It says plus or minus 10%, so technically it's 2,200 words basically. But what I want you to think about is not the issue of what does that mean, but the way in which you're going to approach it and manage it. To be blunt, there are going to be a lot of people who are going to say, well, I can't manage 2,000 words. My students want to do more than that, and therefore I'm going to take the hit on it. What that means is you're not going to be able to give them 50 out of 50. You are actually going to give them a maximum of 48 out of 50, which is, I know, not a huge penalty. But I want you to step back a minute from that. I hope that you'll, in a way, try with me to engage with students to actually believe that there is a fitness for purpose agenda here, that there is actually a skill in writing something in 2,200 words and trying not to abuse that word limit. And indeed, you know, with changes in the specification, with the linearity, and also changes in content, which may in many instances on our spec have increased content in a few areas, I think that you may not have the luxury of time that you've had previously. So just reflect on this, if you would. I'm going to give you 5 minutes to do this because we want to go to the networking slide so you can get each other's emails. So can you think about how you're going to tackle this? We're going to produce some support materials as well, but indeed, when I see what you may write here, you might help me in terms of writing that support material. I'll come off mic for about 3 or 4 minutes, something like that, for you to reflect on it. And I don't want you to think of it as a challenge as to how do we get away with it, but moreover, how do we support students in trying to come to terms with it? Okay folks, thank you for your very useful and informative comments, and they've certainly given me some food for thought. One of the things we're going to try and work on is a support document for students so that they can think about managing the 2,000 words. So the ideas that you've got here are, you know, really useful for me to do that, and therefore you know, I'll be taking good careful notes on what you've actually said in that. In terms of what we've got here, you've come up with a range of strategies, some of which I think are really useful. As I said before, you'll no doubt see these appearing in the support document. I think it is about a philosophy of approach more than anything, and we have to do our job of making sure that we set up the fieldwork in an appropriate way, so we're not expecting a great variety of fieldwork techniques to be written about. Now, that doesn't mean I want you to limit what you do in the field, but I think what it needs to be is manageable in terms of the write-up. So if you do, like we saw with the Westfield example, 7 or 8 techniques in the field because you think they're valuable, and I agree with you, but actually the write-up may involve them selecting, let's say, 2 or 3 of those, or however many it is, to make that manageable for them. So I think that we've got to do our job there, and indeed some of these tasks actually lend themselves to brevity. So for instance, if you take the rivers one here, investigate whether width, depth and velocity always increase downstream. Well, they would be the things that I would expect you to mainline on in terms of the field work that you're doing there. You may measure other things like gradient, or I don't know, calculate discharge or whatever it is. I don't want you to stop from doing those, but I want the students to appreciate that's what they have to do. Now, for some of those broader tasks that we have, you need to help them and steer them into a more manageable direction. Some of you have also come up with some other sensible suggestions, very sensible indeed, in terms of exemplar material. We're going to certainly try and work towards producing some A grade, A star grade 2,000 pieces of work, and I know that we must hold our hands up when we've produced pieces of work in the past. They may have been at 2,500 or 3,000 words, so we've all got to realign our expectations here. Indeed, some of you already limit your students in various ways to the 2,000 word product. I don't want us to get down the line, and indeed it sort of, I suppose, indicates this in the spec, but go down the line of saying, right, we need to make sure that everyone does a word count, and I'm going to be counting every single word that you actually have. That's not necessarily what it is we want you to do. I think we need to be more realistic than that. But equally, if you've got access, as one of you have said, if you've got access to spell check through Microsoft Word or whatever it is, it does make the job a little bit easier for you, and for the students as well. And I think that that's a very, very useful. So I hope you had time to reflect on some of these, if you, like me, are thinking I'd like to save these for prosperity, there's an easy way. You can just do a copy and paste job on the comments that are in there. Okay, so you just copy them out of the comments box, and you can paste them into a Word document, and I think that's a useful way of preserving the things. You don't have to do it now. You can actually, I suspect, do it in the recording as well. Remember that this session is being recorded for you. So there we go. Now we're going to go back to our presentation that we've got. Time is running away with us, and it's pretty important that we get back to the final final sections about managing. Now there is a little activity in here, and I think what I'll do is I'm going to, because I've run out of time and given perhaps too much time talking, I'm going to very quickly skip through this. I want to give you an opportunity to share emails. I think that's more important. But there are 2 activities in here, and you have a copy of this in your PowerPoint and also in your download documents, which is these true or falses. With your department, particularly if you're new to doing this, have an opportunity to reflect on which one of these you think are correct. There's some that are deliberately ambiguous about management of controlled assessment. And if you are unclear about any of them, you think, right, I really don't know the answer to that, perhaps you want to email them in the Ask the Expert. We don't have time to go through all of them now. Some of them are very obvious, but some of them require a little bit of thinking about and discussion, to be honest. And I think that that's really, really key as part of what we're doing here, to actually be prepared to, sort of use the Ask the Expert services and things we've got. So that's something you can do. As I said before, we've got this communities forum, we've got the Ask the Expert website, which I know some of you do involve yourself with. So please use those as the channels by which you can come in. Thank you for doing those so quickly. Just while you're typing those in, I've got one question that's come in which is very pertinent, and I think I can give you an answer. When will the support documents, exemplar materials to CA be published? That's a good question. One of the things Pearson is doing is rewriting the controlled assessment workbook for this spec, and actually producing it as a free download. That will be springtime. That will be available. It's not quite written yet, and that will outline, I think, many of the things we're talking about. One of the other support mechanisms we're trying to put in place is the 2,000 word document. How do you manage that we've talked about as well? And there are also going to be, and these will be done in spring, some exemplar materials for the 2,000 words. So it's all in place at the moment. We've got to try and juggle it with exams and all those sorts of things as well. I'm sure that you appreciate we, like you, are incredibly busy. And the person who had to go to their Year 9 Parents' Evening, you are excused. You don't need the doctor's note or anything like that. Okay, I'm going to get towards the wrap up. I hope it's been an interesting, informative, and if you're new to online training, quite an experience where you can think, actually, this is sort of not a replacement for face-to-face, but it does work in the context of communicating with each other, and I hope it's been useful for you. I'm going to sign off, as I said before, very, very shortly. I'm going to hand back to Chloe and to John. They've just got a sort of sign-off message for you, and of course you will be emailed an evaluation if you haven't already received it for today's event as well. There's just a quick questions come in. Sorry, I think I've missed the answer to, will annotations count in the word limit? The answer to that is yes. Anything that's in there will count in the word limit. So this is trying to avoid this kind of putting boxes around stuff situation. But as I said previously, we have to be realistic about this. If it's 2,250 words or whatever, then I don't think any of us are going to mind, and we're not going to resign over it. But it says in the spec it should be that number of words. So, clearly me as principal moderator, I have to try and do things by the book, and you have to sign a cover sheet at the end, and we'll give you those support documents as well. Okay, so I'm going to hand over to Chloe. Thanks for today's session, and thank you very much for your useful, supportive, engaging comments. This sort of process doesn't work without you actually doing this, so thanks for that, and I hope it's been useful for you. So I'll sign off and hand over to Chloe.